My elderly landlord knocked on my door at 3 a.m. saying, "Your husband just loaded all your belongings into a moving truck with another woman." I stood in the doorway staring at Mrs. Kapoor, my 78-year-old landlord who lived in the unit below mine, and who in 3 years had never once knocked after 9 p.m. She was wearing a pink bathrobe and slippers, her gray hair in rollers, her face etched with concern, and something that looked like pity. Behind her in the parking lot, I could see the taillights of a U-Haul truck pulling onto the street, disappearing around the corner. My brain struggled to process what she'd just said. My husband David was supposed to be at a medical conference in Portland. He'd left yesterday morning with his overnight bag and kissed me goodbye, saying he'd be back Saturday afternoon. It was Thursday night, technically Friday morning now, and Mrs. Kapoor was telling me he'd just stolen everything I owned. I grabbed my phone from the charging station and called David's cell. It rang twice before going to voicemail. I called again, and the same thing happened. 2 rings, then voicemail, which meant he was actively declining my calls. Mrs. Kapoor touched my arm gently and said she'd been up with insomnia, sitting by her window with tea when she saw David's car pull into the lot around 1:30 a.m. She thought it was strange because she knew he was supposed to be out of town. Then she watched him unlock our apartment with his key and start carrying furniture out. A blonde woman she'd never seen before was helping him load boxes into the truck. I pushed past Mrs. Kapoor and ran barefoot down the exterior stairs to the parking lot. David's designated spot was empty. I looked up at our second-floor apartment and saw the windows were dark. I'd been asleep in our bed, exhausted from a double shift at the hospital where I worked as an ICU nurse, and hadn't heard anything. I ran back upstairs and threw open the door to our apartment. The living room was empty. The couch was gone, the TV was gone, the coffee table and bookshelf were gone. I ran to the bedroom and found my side of the closet still full of my clothes, but David's side was completely empty. The dresser drawers were pulled out, his half cleaned out entirely. The bed was still there because it was my bed from before we got married, but his nightstand was gone. In the bathroom, all his toiletries had been removed. The medicine cabinet was half empty. I went to the kitchen and opened cabinets to find half the dishes missing, half the pots and pans gone. He'd taken his things and anything we'd bought together, leaving me with only what I'd brought into the marriage. My hands were shaking as I called his phone again. Voicemail. I sent a text demanding to know what was happening and where he was. The message showed as delivered but not read. Mrs. Kapoor had followed me upstairs and now stood in the doorway looking at the empty apartment. She said the woman helping David had been young, maybe late 20s, with long blonde hair and expensive-looking clothes. They'd worked quickly and efficiently, like they'd planned this carefully. They'd filled the truck in under an hour. Mrs. Kapoor had almost called the police, but then she recognized David and figured there must be some explanation. That's when she decided to wake me up. I thanked her and told her I'd handle it from here, though I had no idea how to handle any of this. She left reluctantly, telling me to knock on her door if I needed anything. I stood in the stripped apartment trying to understand what had just happened. David and I had been married for 2 years. We'd met at a hospital fundraiser where he was representing his pharmaceutical sales company. He was charming and attentive, 11 years older than me at 43 to my 32, and he'd swept me into a whirlwind romance that led to marriage within 8 months. Looking back now, that speed should have been a red flag, but I'd been lonely after a bad breakup and David had made me feel special. We'd had arguments like any couple, mostly about money and his tendency to make big decisions without consulting me, but nothing that suggested he was planning to abandon me in the middle of the night. I called David's office number even though it was 3:30 in the morning and obviously no one would answer. I left a voicemail explaining that he'd apparently moved out while I was sleeping and asking him to call me immediately. Then I called his best friend Trevor, who answered groggily after 6 rings. I apologized for waking him and asked if he knew where David was. Trevor sounded genuinely confused and said he'd talked to David yesterday morning before the Portland conference, and everything seemed normal. I told Trevor what had happened and heard him sit up in bed, suddenly alert. He said this made no sense, that David had never mentioned problems in our marriage or any plans to leave. Trevor promised to try calling David and get back to me. I hung up and looked around the apartment again, noticing new details. The framed wedding photos were gone from the walls. The joint bank account documents were missing from the filing cabinet. David's laptop and tablet were gone. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in anger. This was premeditated, planned, and executed with precision. He'd waited until I was working a night shift earlier in the week to pack boxes in secret. He'd rented a moving truck and recruited someone to help him. He'd timed it for when I'd be sleeping deeply after an exhausting shift. The cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. I logged into our joint bank account on my phone and felt my stomach drop. The account had been drained. David had transferred $23,000 to an account I didn't recognize, leaving exactly $47 in checking. Our savings account showed the same pattern, cleaned out except for the minimum balance to keep it open. I checked our credit cards and found he'd maxed out the one in my name, charging $8,000 in purchases over the past week at stores I didn't recognize. Meanwhile, he'd paid off his personal credit card in full. I took screenshots of everything, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone steady. This wasn't just abandonment. This was financial devastation. David had stolen our shared money, destroyed my credit, and left me with nothing but debt and an apartment full of empty rooms. I called the bank's emergency fraud line and spent 20 minutes explaining the situation to a representative who said that because David was an authorized user on the accounts, the transfers weren't technically fraud. She suggested I file a police report and contact a lawyer. The credit card company said the same thing, that charges made by an authorized user couldn't be disputed as fraudulent even if I hadn't made them. I was learning that spousal financial abuse existed in a legal gray area where theft wasn't really theft if you were married to the thief. Trevor called back at 4:15 a.m. and said David's phone was going straight to voicemail now. Not even ringing. He'd tried 3 times and sent several texts with no response. Trevor sounded worried and kept saying this wasn't normal David behavior, that something must have happened to make him snap. I wanted to believe that. Wanted to think my husband had experienced some kind of mental breakdown that explained this cruelty, but the evidence suggested careful planning rather than impulsive crisis. I asked Trevor if David had ever mentioned a blonde woman, maybe someone from work. There was a pause on the line before Trevor said David had hired a new sales associate about 6 months ago named Brittany Lowell. She was in her late 20s, had just moved to our city from California, and Trevor had met her once at a company happy hour. He said she seemed friendly and professional, nothing that raised red flags. I asked Trevor for Brittany's contact information, and he said he'd try to find it. We hung up with Trevor, promising to keep trying to reach David. I sat on the floor in the empty living room and tried to remember the past 6 months for signs I'd missed. David had been working longer hours, coming home late several nights a week. He'd been on his phone constantly, texting and smiling at messages he never shared with me. When I'd asked about it, he'd said work was busy and his boss was demanding. He'd started going to the gym more often, losing weight and buying new clothes. He'd been less interested in physical intimacy, usually too tired or stressed for sex. All classic affair red flags that I'd ignored because I trusted him and because I was too exhausted from my own demanding job to investigate. Now those signs seemed obvious, a trail of breadcrumbs leading to this moment. I pulled up our cell phone account and looked at David's usage history. His text messages and call logs showed hundreds of communications with one number over the past 6 months, increasing dramatically in the past 2 weeks. I ran the number through a reverse lookup service and found it was registered to Brittany Lowell at an address across town. I felt sick. My husband hadn't just left me. He'd been planning his exit for months while sleeping beside me every night, kissing me goodbye every morning, lying with extraordinary dedication and skill. I called a 24-hour locksmith service and paid extra for emergency rates to have them come change the locks on the apartment immediately. The locksmith arrived at 5:30 a.m. and spent 40 minutes installing new deadbolts on both doors. He was kind enough not to ask questions about why a woman needed locks changed at dawn in an apartment that was clearly half empty. I called my sister Nora at 6 a.m. because she was an early riser and I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. She answered on the second ring and I broke down completely, sobbing as I explained what had happened. Nora lived 2 hours away, but said she'd get in the car immediately and be at my apartment by 8 o'clock. She told me to document everything with photos, to not clean or touch anything, to gather every piece of evidence I could find. She said her friend was a divorce attorney and she'd call her as soon as business hours started. Nora stayed on the phone with me while she got dressed and made coffee, talking me through breathing exercises and telling me this wasn't my fault. I needed to hear that because I'd already started the self-blame spiral, questioning what I'd done wrong and how I'd failed to keep my husband happy. Nora shut that down hard, saying David was the one who'd chosen lies and cruelty, that his actions reflected his character and not my worth. We hung up with her, promising to call me from the road. I walked through the apartment, taking photos of every empty space, every missing piece of furniture, every cleaned-out drawer. I photographed the bank statements on my phone, the maxed-out credit card, the text message logs showing David's constant communication with Brittany. I was building a case without fully understanding what the case would be for. At 7 a.m., I called the hospital and told my supervisor I had a family emergency and couldn't come in for my scheduled shift that evening. My supervisor, Karen, had worked with me for 5 years and could hear the distress in my voice. She didn't ask questions, just told me to take whatever time I needed and to keep her updated. I was grateful because I couldn't have explained the situation without breaking down again. I made coffee in the kitchen using the pot David had left behind because it was mine from before the marriage. Everything in the apartment had been mentally divided into mine, his, and ours, with David taking anything that fell into the his or ours categories. It was petty and calculating, designed to leave me with as little as possible while protecting himself from accusations of theft. The legality of it made me furious. Because we were married and everything was technically joint property until divorce, he could take whatever he wanted and the police wouldn't do anything. I'd called them anyway, right after the locksmith left, and the responding officer had confirmed that this was a civil matter, not a criminal one. He'd suggested I file for divorce and let the courts sort out property division. The officer had been sympathetic but helpless, another system that protected perpetrators over victims. Trevor called back at 7:30 a.m. with Brittany Lowell's contact information, which he'd gotten from the company directory. He said he'd tried calling David's work phone, and it went straight to voicemail there too. Trevor had also called the Portland hotel where the conference was supposedly happening, and confirmed that David had never checked in, that there was no reservation under his name. The conference itself was real, and several other sales reps from their company were attending, but David had apparently lied about going. Trevor sounded shocked and kept apologizing as if David's actions were somehow his fault. I thanked him for the information and hung up. I stared at Brittany's phone number on my screen and debated whether to call her. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to demand answers about how long this had been going on, and whether she knew David was married when it started. Another part of me knew that conversation would accomplish nothing, and would only give her the satisfaction of knowing she'd destroyed me. I decided to wait, to gather more information before making contact. Nora arrived at 8:15 a.m. with 2 large coffees and a bag of pastries from the bakery near her house. She took one look at the empty apartment and her face went hard with anger. She walked through every room with me, taking her own photos and making notes on her phone. Nora was a paralegal at a law firm and approached problems with methodical precision. She asked detailed questions about our finances, our joint assets, the timeline of David's suspicious behavior. She reviewed the bank statements and credit card charges on my phone and said David had clearly been planning this for weeks, possibly months. The timing of the transfers, the strategic maxing out of credit, the careful removal of joint property, all suggested premeditation. Nora called her friend Denise Wu, the divorce attorney, and put her on speakerphone. Denise listened to the summary of what had happened and said she could meet with me that afternoon at 2 p.m. She warned me that untangling marital finances would be complicated and potentially expensive, but that David's actions gave us leverage. The fact that he'd drained accounts and maxed out credit in my name could be used against him in divorce proceedings. Denise asked if I had access to copies of our tax returns, mortgage documents, or any other financial records. I said most of those were digital and stored on David's laptop, which he'd taken. Denise told me to call the accountant who'd prepared our taxes and request copies of everything. She also told me to pull my credit report immediately to see what other damage David might have done. I hung up and spent the next hour following Denise's instructions. The credit report revealed David had opened 2 new credit cards in my name over the past month without my knowledge. Both were maxed out with combined charges totaling $15,000. My credit score had dropped 180 points. I felt violated in a way that went beyond betrayal. This wasn't just a man leaving his wife. This was systematic financial destruction designed to cripple me while enriching himself. Nora made a fresh pot of coffee, and we sat on the floor since there was no furniture left in the living room. She asked if David had family nearby who might know something. His parents lived in Arizona, and we only saw them twice a year. I called his mother Carol anyway, and asked if she'd heard from David recently. Carol sounded cheerful and said she'd talked to him 2 days ago and he'd seemed fine, mentioned he was busy with work and looking forward to the holidays. I took a deep breath and told her David had moved out in the middle of the night with another woman and had drained our bank accounts. There was a long silence on the line before Carol said there must be some mistake, that David would never do something so cruel and irresponsible. She suggested I was overreacting and that David had probably just needed some space and would come back after cooling off. I told her about the moving truck, the empty accounts, the maxed out credit cards in my name. Carol's tone shifted to defensive, saying she didn't know anything about David's personal decisions and that marital problems were between us. She hung up quickly after that, leaving me staring at the phone in disbelief. Even David's own mother was choosing to protect him rather than acknowledge what he'd done. Trevor called again at 10 a.m. and said he'd driven to Brittany Lowell's apartment and seen David's car parked in the visitor lot. He'd knocked on her door, but no one answered. Trevor said he'd left a note asking David to call him urgently. I asked Trevor to describe the apartment building, and he said it was a luxury complex with a doorman, the kind of place that cost at least $3,000 a month. That aligned with the bank transfers I'd seen, David funneling our shared money into an account that was probably funding his new life with Brittany. Trevor sounded disgusted and kept saying he'd thought he knew David better than this. He promised to keep me updated if he heard anything. Nora spent the morning helping me make lists of everything that had been taken from the apartment. We went room by room, documenting missing items and estimating their value. The total came to roughly $18,000 in furniture, electronics, and household goods. When combined with the stolen money and fraudulent credit charges, David had extracted or destroyed about $70,000 of our shared assets while leaving me with nothing but debt and empty rooms. Denise Wu had said we'd need this documentation for the divorce filing. At 1 p.m., I finally decided to call Brittany Lowell. Her phone rang 4 times before she answered with a cautious hello. I identified myself as David's wife, and there was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. I kept my voice calm and asked how long she'd been sleeping with my husband. Brittany didn't hang up, which surprised me. Instead, she said she didn't owe me any explanations, and that what happened between her and David was none of my business. I laughed bitterly and told her that actually it was very much my business since David had stolen my money and destroyed my credit to fund their relationship. Brittany was quiet for a moment before saying she didn't know anything about stolen money. She claimed David had told her he was separated and living alone, that the divorce was already in progress. I asked when this supposed separation had happened, and she said David had moved out 3 weeks ago. I told her that was a lie, that David had been sleeping in our bed every night until he snuck out at 1:30 this morning with her help. Brittany sounded less certain now, her voice wavering as she insisted David had showed her divorce papers. I said those papers didn't exist, and that if she didn't believe me, She could check our joint social media accounts where David had posted a photo of us having dinner together just 4 days ago. There was a long pause before Brittany said quietly that she needed to go, and the line went dead. I sat there feeling hollow. Part of me had wanted Brittany to be the villain, the seductress who'd stolen my husband, but the conversation suggested she might be another victim of David's lies. That didn't excuse her participation in helping him move out, but it complicated the narrative I'd been building. Nora and I drove to Denise Wu's law office for the 2 p.m. meeting. Denise was a sharp woman in her 50s with short gray hair and an office lined with legal books. She reviewed all the documentation I'd brought and asked detailed questions about our marriage, our assets, David's income, and my financial situation. I explained that David made significantly more money than me, around $120,000 a year in pharmaceutical sales compared to my $65,000 nursing salary. We'd kept our income in joint accounts and split bills equally, which now seemed foolish given how easy it had been for him to steal everything. Denise said Oregon was an equitable distribution state, which meant marital property would be divided fairly, but not necessarily equally in divorce. The fact that David had hidden assets and destroyed my credit would work in my favor. She could file for an emergency hearing to freeze his accounts and prevent him from causing more financial damage. The retainer for her services was $5,000, which I didn't have since David had cleaned out our accounts. Denise offered to take payments over time, and I accepted gratefully. She said she'd file divorce papers by end of business today and serve David by Monday. She'd also file a motion for temporary spousal support given the income disparity and David's theft of marital funds. Denise warned me this would get ugly, that David had already shown he was willing to lie and manipulate to get what he wanted. We left the law office at 4 p.m., and Nora drove me to Target to buy an air mattress, sheets, and basic supplies since David had taken my bed frame. She insisted on paying for everything despite my protests. We loaded the car and headed back to my apartment. On the way, Trevor called and said David had finally responded to his texts. David's message had said he was sorry for the way things happened, but he'd tried to talk to me about our problems, and I never listened. Trevor had responded asking what problems David meant and got no reply. Trevor forwarded me the text exchange and I read David's message multiple times, trying to find truth in his revision of history. We'd never had serious conversations about divorce or separation. We'd argued about his working late and about money management, but those were normal marital disagreements, not grounds for abandonment. David was rewriting our marriage to justify his actions, creating a narrative where he was the victim of an unhappy situation rather than the architect of deliberate cruelty. I showed the text to Nora and she said this was classic manipulation, that David was already building his defense for why he'd had to leave. We spent the evening setting up the air mattress in my bedroom and making the apartment somewhat livable again. Nora ordered pizza and we ate sitting on the floor, talking about practical next steps. I'd need to open new bank accounts in only my name. I'd need to notify my credit card companies about the fraud and try to dispute the charges. I'd need to change passwords on all my online accounts in case David had access. I'd need to file police reports about the identity theft, even if they couldn't prosecute. The list was overwhelming, and Nora helped me prioritize, creating a schedule for the next week. At 9 p.m., my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered cautiously, and heard David's voice for the first time since this nightmare began. He sounded tired and defensive as he said we needed to talk about what happened. I asked where he was, and he said that didn't matter, that he wanted to explain his side. I told him I'd already heard his side from Trevor's text and it was complete fiction. David got angry and said I was always dismissing his feelings, that I'd been emotionally unavailable for months, and he'd felt trapped in a loveless marriage. I asked why. If he felt that way, he hadn't suggested counseling or even had an honest conversation, instead of stealing everything and running away in the middle of the night. David said he'd tried to talk to me, and I never had time because I was always working. I reminded him that I worked night shifts at a hospital to save lives while he sold pharmaceuticals, and that my schedule had been the same throughout our marriage. He'd known what he was signing up for when he married a nurse. David's voice got cold as he said he wanted to handle the divorce civilly, and that if I made things difficult, he'd make sure I got nothing in the settlement. I told him I'd already hired an attorney and filed paperwork, that his threats were meaningless. He seemed surprised and asked who was paying for my lawyer since he'd taken all our money. I said that was none of his business and hung up. My hands were shaking with rage. The call confirmed what I'd suspected, that David felt entitled to his cruelty and expected me to quietly accept it. Nora put her hand on my shoulder and said I'd handled the call perfectly, that I hadn't let him manipulate me into backing down. She stayed that night, sleeping on the air mattress with me since there was only one bed now. We stayed up late talking about my marriage and all the red flags I'd missed. David had always been controlling about money, insisting we use joint accounts and making large purchases without discussion. He'd been dismissive of my career, making jokes about nurses being overworked and underpaid. He'd isolated me from friends by scheduling trips and events that conflicted with their plans. Looking back with clarity, I could see the pattern of behavior that had seemed normal at the time. Saturday morning, Denise called to say David had been served with divorce papers at Brittany's apartment. The process server reported that David had been shocked and angry. Denise had also filed the emergency motion to freeze accounts, and the hearing was scheduled for Wednesday morning. She warned me that David's attorney would likely portray him as a husband who'd left an unhappy marriage and taken only his fair share of property. Our job would be to prove his actions were calculated and malicious. I spent the weekend gathering more documentation. I found old credit card statements showing David had been buying expensive gifts over the past 6 months, jewelry and perfume and dinners at restaurants we'd never been to together. These were gifts for Brittany, purchased with our shared money while I worked overtime to pay our bills. I found text messages I'd saved where David had promised to cut back on spending and help save for a down payment on a house. Those promises had been lies while he was actually draining our accounts. I made copies of everything and sent them to Denise. By Sunday evening, Nora had to go home to her own family, and I was alone in the apartment for the first time since Thursday night. The silence was oppressive. I kept expecting to hear David's keys in the door, his voice calling hello, the normal sounds of shared life that had filled this space for 2 years. Instead, there was nothing but empty rooms and the hum of the refrigerator. I couldn't sleep that night, lying on the air mattress and replaying the past 3 days on an endless loop. Monday morning, I went back to work for a day shift I'd picked up to replace the one I'd missed. My coworkers knew something was wrong from the moment I arrived. Karen pulled me aside and asked if I was okay to work, and I lied and said yes because I needed the distraction. The shift was brutal. Every time I had a quiet moment, my mind wandered back to David and Brittany and the life they were building with my stolen money. One of my patients was a man who'd had a heart attack, and his wife sat by his bed holding his hand, and I had to leave the room because seeing their devotion made me want to scream. During lunch, Karen found me crying in the break room, and I finally told her what had happened. She was horrified and angry on my behalf. She said the hospital had resources for employees in crisis, including an employee assistance program that offered free counseling. She made me promise to call them. Trevor texted during my shift saying he'd confronted David about the financial theft, and David had denied it, claiming he'd only taken his half of everything. Trevor had asked about the maxed-out credit cards in my name, and David had said those were joint cards I'd used too, which was technically true, but deliberately misleading since he'd made all the recent charges. Trevor said David was spinning the narrative to make himself look reasonable, and that several mutual friends were believing his version. This was my first taste of how divorce split communities. People who'd been our friends were now being forced to choose sides, and many were choosing David because his story was cleaner and easier to believe. The idea that a charming, successful man would systematically destroy his wife's life was harder to accept than the story of an unhappy marriage ending badly for both people. By Tuesday, I'd filed police reports about the identity theft and credit fraud. The detective who took my statement was kind but honest, telling me that spousal financial abuse cases rarely resulted in prosecution. The fact that we were married when the charges occurred made it nearly impossible to prove criminal intent. He suggested I focus on the civil divorce case where a judge could at least order David to pay back what he'd stolen. The detective's pragmatism was depressing but helpful. It recalibrated my expectations from justice to damage control. Wednesday morning, Denise and I appeared in court for the emergency hearing. David showed up with an attorney named Philip Granger who looked expensive in a tailored suit. David wouldn't make eye contact with me. Brittany wasn't there, and I wondered if she was avoiding the reality of what she'd helped facilitate. The judge reviewed our motions and evidence. Denise presented the bank statements showing David had drained accounts without notice, the credit cards he'd maxed out in my name, the documentation of property he'd removed. Philip argued that David had only taken his personal belongings and a fair share of joint property. And he claimed the credit card charges were for shared household expenses accumulated over months. The judge wasn't buying it. She reviewed the timeline and dates and noted that David had made substantial charges in the week before leaving, including purchases at furniture stores and electronics retailers. She ruled that David's accounts would be frozen except for basic living expenses, until a full asset division could be determined at trial. She also ordered David to make temporary monthly payments of $2,000 to me for spousal support. Philip objected, but the judge cut him off, saying David's income was a matter of record and he could afford the payments. David's face went red with anger. After the hearing ended, David tried to approach me in the hallway, but Denise stepped between us and told him all communication needed to go through attorneys. David looked at me and said I was destroying his life over a simple breakup. I stared back and said he'd destroyed my life over an affair, that there was nothing simple about what he'd done. Philip pulled David away before he could respond. Denise was pleased with the outcome. She said the temporary support would help me stay afloat financially while we built the divorce case. She warned that David would likely try to hide assets or transfer money before trial. We needed to work quickly to document everything he owned. I went home exhausted and found a letter taped to my apartment door. It was from Mrs. Kapoor saying she'd noticed David's car in the parking lot this afternoon and thought I should know. The timing meant he'd been here while I was at court. I called the property management office and asked if anyone had entered my apartment. The manager said David had come by with identification showing this was his address and claimed he needed to pick up mail. They'd let him into the building. My stomach dropped. I rushed inside and looked around frantically. Everything appeared the same at first, but then I noticed small things missing. My laptop was gone from the bedroom, the one I'd used to store personal documents and photos. A jewelry box from my dresser was missing, not expensive pieces, but items with sentimental value, including my grandmother's wedding ring. David had come back during the court hearing specifically to take things he knew would hurt me. I called Denise immediately. and she told me to file another police report and document what had been taken. She'd file a motion for contempt since David had violated the spirit of the court order by taking more property. This back and forth was exhausting. Every time I thought I'd reached the bottom of David's cruelty, he found new depths. Trevor called that evening sounding upset. He said he'd been at a bar with work friends and overheard David and Brittany laughing about the court hearing. David had been telling people I was trying to take everything he'd worked for and that I was a vindictive ex who couldn't accept the marriage was over. Brittany had been giggling and calling me pathetic. Trevor said he'd confronted David and they'd gotten into a shouting match that ended with David telling Trevor to mind his own business. Their friendship was over. Trevor apologized for not seeing David's true nature sooner. I told him it wasn't his fault and that David had fooled both of us. Over the next month, the divorce proceedings got increasingly hostile. David's attorney filed motions claiming I'd been verbally abusive during the marriage and that I'd refused to contribute equally to household finances. Both claims were complete fabrications, but they required responses and documentation to refute. Denise filed counter-motions showing David's pattern of financial control and abuse. We submitted evidence of his affair, including phone records and witness statements from Trevor and Mrs. Kapoor. The court ordered mediation, but it was pointless. David refused to compromise on anything, demanding he keep the majority of our assets because he'd earned more money. The mediator looked uncomfortable as David's attorney argued that my nursing salary was insufficient to justify equal asset division. Denise countered that Oregon law didn't base property division on income, but on fairness, and that my contributions to the marriage included supporting David's career by managing our home. The mediation ended with no agreement. We'd have to go to trial. During this time, I learned more about Brittany through mutual acquaintances. She'd transferred to our city to escape a messy situation in California, where she'd been involved with her married boss. That relationship had ended badly when the boss's wife discovered the affair and made sure Brittany was blacklisted in their industry. Brittany had come to David's company looking for a fresh start and had apparently decided married men were her specialty. The pattern suggested she was as much a predator as David, not the naive victim I'd briefly imagined. They deserved each other. My credit was ruined despite my best efforts to dispute charges. The credit card companies said David's name on the accounts meant the charges were valid. Collections agencies started calling about missed payments. I had to work extra shifts to stay current on rent and basic expenses. The $2,000 monthly support from David helped, but it was barely enough to cover necessities. Denise filed motions to increase the amount, but David's attorney argued he couldn't afford more because he was paying rent at Brittany's expensive apartment. The irony of David claiming poverty while living in luxury made me want to scream. The trial was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Denise spent hours preparing me to testify, warning me that David's attorney would try to make me look unstable or vindictive. She coached me on staying calm, on answering only what was asked, on not letting Philip Granger provoke me into emotional outbursts. We practiced cross-examination scenarios until I felt confident I could handle it. The night before trial, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the woman I'd been 3 months ago, naive and trusting, believing my marriage was imperfect but solid. David had destroyed that woman completely. In her place was someone harder, more cynical, less willing to believe in people's goodness. I mourned the loss of innocence as much as the loss of my marriage. The trial lasted 3 days. I testified first, describing David's systematic theft and deception. I remained calm even when Philip tried to suggest I'd been financially irresponsible and had driven David to desperate measures. Denise objected repeatedly and the judge sustained most of her objections. Trevor testified about David's affair and the lies he'd told. Mrs. Kapoor testified about witnessing David remove property in the middle of the night. Our accountant testified about the joint assets and how David had emptied accounts right before leaving. David took the stand on day 2 and lied smoothly. He claimed we'd had multiple conversations about separating, and that I'd agreed he could take his belongings. He said the credit card charges were for things we'd both used. He portrayed himself as a reasonable man trying to escape an unhappy situation while I played the part of bitter ex. His performance was impressive and I could see some sympathy from the judge. Then Denise began her cross-examination. She asked David to explain why, if separation was mutual, he'd moved out while I was sleeping. She asked him to identify which items in the apartment had been his before marriage versus joint purchases. She asked him to explain the $23,000 transfer to Brittany's account. David fumbled the answers, contradicting himself repeatedly. Denise produced evidence we'd subpoenaed showing David had opened a separate bank account 3 months before leaving and had been transferring money there gradually. He'd hidden over $40,000 in this secret account. David's attorney objected that this was just financial planning, but the judge's expression suggested she wasn't convinced. Brittany was subpoenaed to testify on day 3. She looked nervous in a conservative dress, probably coached by David on how to appear sympathetic. Denise asked her about her relationship with David and when it started. Brittany claimed they'd only become romantically involved after David had separated from me, maintaining the lie despite phone records proving otherwise. Denise produced text messages between Brittany and David from 7 months ago, explicitly romantic and sexual in nature. Brittany's face went white. She'd committed perjury and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Philip requested a recess to consult with his client and Denise objected, pointing out that perjury was a serious matter. The judge agreed and warned Brittany to answer truthfully. Brittany admitted she and David had been seeing each other for 8 months while he was still living with me. She said she'd believed him when he said our marriage was over and everything but paperwork. The judge asked if Brittany was aware David had used marital funds to pay for their relationship expenses. Brittany said she hadn't known where the money came from. The judge's skepticism was obvious. After closing arguments, the judge said she'd review the evidence and issue a ruling within 2 weeks. Denise was cautiously optimistic. She said the perjury and hidden accounts had damaged David's credibility significantly. 2 weeks felt eternal, but finally the ruling came. The judge found that David had engaged in deliberate deception and financial misconduct. She ordered him to reimburse me for the drained accounts, pay off the fraudulent credit card charges, and return the value of property he'd taken. The total judgment was $68,000. She also ordered him to pay my attorney fees since his misconduct had necessitated legal action. The asset division heavily favored me given his behavior. David would pay $3,500 monthly spousal support for 3 years, enough time for me to rebuild my finances. The ruling was more than I'd hoped for. Denise called it a complete victory. David's attorney filed an appeal, but it was denied. David was furious and refused to comply with the payment schedule. Denise filed contempt motions and the judge threatened jail time. David finally started making payments, though always late and always accompanied by nasty texts to Denise. 6 months after that 3 a.m. knock, I was slowly rebuilding my life. The apartment had new furniture bought with the reimbursement money. My credit was recovering as fraudulent charges were removed. I'd started therapy to process the trauma and betrayal. I'd gone on a few dates, though, trusting anyone felt impossible. David and Brittany broke up after the trial, probably because the fantasy of their relationship couldn't survive the reality of legal consequences and financial loss. I heard through Trevor that Brittany had moved back to California, and David was living alone in a small apartment, bitter and broke after paying judgments and attorney fees. Trevor and I had dinner occasionally, and he always apologized for not seeing David's true nature sooner. I told him repeatedly that none of this was his fault. Mrs. Kapoor checked on me weekly, bringing tea and sweets and sitting in my living room asking how I was really doing. Her presence that night had saved me from even worse damage. If she hadn't woken me, David might have cleaned out more while I slept. Small mercies mattered. The nursing staff at the hospital became my support system, covering shifts when I had court dates and bringing me meals when I was too stressed to cook. Karen told me I was stronger than I knew, and that surviving David's cruelty was proof of that strength. I didn't feel strong most days, but I was learning that strength looked like getting out of bed when you wanted to stay hidden, showing up to work when everything felt pointless, choosing to trust people again even after being devastated. 1 year later, I sat in my fully furnished apartment drinking coffee and looking at the morning light through new curtains. The divorce was final. David was a closed chapter. The woman who'd answered the door at 3 a.m. to hear her world was ending had survived and rebuilt something better. Not unmarked, not unchanged, but standing. That was enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.